We have about an hour, a little over an hour, for a conversation about one of the major issues facing our society, whether it's from the local, national, or international context. You've all seen me, but as you know, I'm Jean Garrison, and I'm a little selfish in the selection of this topic because it's also my particular interest for research. And one of the things that usually happens when you organize a panel is you start getting a slate of terrific people, and then you slowly make it so you don't get to say anything. So I'm going to operate more as the moderator, but that also means I get the last word on conversations. So secretly, I'm going to hear what they have to say, and then I'm going to put in my 2 cents. But the premise of this discussion, first of all, it also launches a series of research-oriented panels across this afternoon, focusing on student research, faculty, student projects, and then also faculty research. So I invite you to take a look at the agenda, the full conference agenda. Stick with us across the afternoon and also join us for the reception, which has an international poster session as well as some libation for you at 6 o'clock tonight. So I invite you to stay across the rest of the afternoon. But to start us off, we have an issue which is, as I've already noted, is really important not only to our society but also to our state. So the premise of this roundtable discussion is that access to cheap and reliable energy, specifically fossil fuels, has fueled economic growth for the United States and the world. This is still true. Access to cheap energy is the engine for economic development in the modern era. Recent scientific and industry advances, including the unconventional energy boom that we're undergoing currently, provide a positive near and mid-term vision for our energy future, which are challenged by concerns voiced by other experts talking about the trade-offs of our energy use patterns. So in a sense, we've got an environment from a geopolitical perspective. I'm a political scientist. We've thought about the politics of scarcity and the politics of vulnerability for many years involving energy. We also have some of that discussion in the context of the climate security debate as well. And yet we still use energy. I don't see anybody not turning their lights on. Okay, at night, about 7 o'clock this time of year. So we have some very interesting issues to talk about, and it seemed very important to bring a group of people from our own campus from a variety of perspectives. You all have a bio on your table, so I won't take time to introduce people other than to say the purpose was to bring people from the sciences and the social sciences to talk about the energy issues and the energy reality from a number of perspectives. And we're pairing these voices. We're going to go in the order in which people are listed. I'll do a very brief introduction, and that is to say that our first panelist on the roundtable discussion is Dr. Khalid Gassim, who is the Associate VP for Academic Affairs and Interim Dean for the College of Engineering and Applied Science. He'll be followed by Indy Burke, Director of the Hobbs School of Environment, Natural Resources, and Biodiversity. Then Chuck Mason, the H.A. Dave True, Junior Professor of Petroleum and Natural Gas Economics, and then Sarah Strauss, Professor of Anthropology. All of the people on this panel do research on energy or the culture of energy or the energy sciences in some form. And so I invite them to make some initial comments, 7 or 8 minutes. We are addressing 3 questions as a starting point. What key opportunities, challenges, and trade-offs do you perceive in our energy usage patterns? What opportunities exist to address these trade-offs in the short, mid, and long term? How do we build a sustainable energy policy that receives broad support from key stakeholders from society, industry, and government? I've asked them all to pay attention to the first question and just comment as they would like based on their work on the others. So I'd like to start with KG.
Good afternoon. My name is Khalid Gassim. I'm the Associate Provost and the Interim Dean for Engineering and Applied Science. It's a pleasure to meet with you. I'm delighted that I received an invitation to share with you some of my thoughts on the subject matter. I have been working in the energy field for about 35 years. My focus has been on fossil fuels, started with enhanced oil recovery to coal conversion, and of late, in the last 15 years, I have been dealing with the unconventional resources. That's coal bed methane and shale gas production and enhanced production of gas using carbon dioxide. So I dealt with carbon dioxide sequestration in geological seams. I'm going to share with you a few points of on how I frame the issues when we discuss the energy supply and the ramifications of our actions in that regard. It's indisputable we need more energy, and the world is definitely moving in the direction of having better quality life for more of the population of the world. Thus, there is a need for energy, and the estimates are we may require up to about 40% by 2030 in the energy supply of the world. Equally important is we have constraints, safety and environmental constraints that we have to be cognizant of, and we have to meet the challenge in that regard. Nature has it that anytime you're using energy, there is a penalty of waste. Whether we like it or not, the first and second law of thermodynamics says there will be waste. The question is, how do we manage the waste, and how do we go about making sure the quality of life is not affected adversely? The third point I want to state is that in developing our strategies for securing our energy supply and seeking sustainability in that regard, we have to accept that for a different time horizon, there will be a different portfolio of technologies providing the energy supply that we need. As we evolve with time, things will change. And we have to be cognizant of that, and that we need to plan for that. The mix of the energy technologies that we have currently, about, say, 85% or so, are based on fossil. That particular number may not exist, say, 30 years, 50 years from now. But it will exist in some fashion. Fossil energy will be part of the mix in the next 3-4 generations. What extent and how do we manage that technologically to make it viable and to make it sustainable? That's the question that we need to address. But the fact of the matter is our energy resources will be made of different technologies, and we have to manage the consequences of the use of the technologies that we select. Change in the mix may come a bit rapidly or may take generations. If I were to deal with the access to more natural gas, the conversion of a few technologies in the oil fields like fracking and horizontal drilling and other techniques that have evolved with time gave us an opportunity and right now an abundance, at least relative abundance, of natural gas. 10 years ago, a projection would not have been made that natural gas would be having a more dominant role in our strategies. So that's a technology that came into fruition, if you would, and helped us in a fairly rapid fashion. If we were to go and decide that having nuclear as part of our strategy in energy supply, to have the right level of density and energy and to have the sustainability and the security thereof, well, then that's generational. It takes about 10 years to 20 years to get a reactor erected. So you cannot hope to have, right now we have currently about 100 reactors. We cannot hope to have another 100 in 10 years. That is not feasible. And we have to be cognizant of that. And a lot of that has to do with more so than a technical solution to an adaptive solution that has to do with our public awareness and acceptance of the types of technologies that we want to plan for and hopefully bring to bear. The informed engagement of our public and their acceptance that we do have to deal with this issue of strategizing on different technologies and in a timely fashion roll them out as feasible and viable as the situation may become in certain sectors of the energy field requires a lot of engagement with the public and requires an understanding. I'll give you an example. Our fear of nuclear energy is definitely borderline inexplainable in some fashion. Because if we really wanted basically sustainable and reliable and with less carbon footprint, an energy source of high density, then we have to accept that we have to take the risk associated with that and manage that risk and know how to deal with it. I think our technologies have evolved that would allow us to do a better job of it. I know every 20 years or so we have a fiasco somewhere, but those are manageable events and can be minimized. But if the public doesn't buy into it, we cannot basically move forward. I take example Germany. They decided to stop everything that has to do with nuclear. In the process, now they have windmills everywhere you look. And the question is, did they affect the quality of life by having, you know, in the perimeters of some cities, windmills? I'm not against wind energy. I want it to be as part of our portfolio, but it has to be done in the right way. We have to balance quantity with quality, with the environmental concerns that we have, and the quality of life associated with the technologies that we use. And if we have alternatives that could offer us a better quality life, why are we running away from those alternatives? Why can't we just be wise enough to be in balance, if you will? I don't know how much time is left for me, but a couple of minutes. That said, I'm going to tell you, I'll give you a kind of sort of reality check when dealing with the energy. So let me just say, no one technology will fulfill the energy needs. Number two, no one energy portfolio will be viable always. So there's a time dependence. No one energy/environment scenario is certain to evolve. It's a dynamic, it's stochastic. We have to deal with that in that sense. No one country can handle the energy environment issues. It is a global context, and we have to accept that, and we have to have the public discourse that supports that and works in that direction. No benefit in trading water for energy. To me, that's, again, it's a little bit off the mark. Why would we take the resources that we have, land and water, and try to create out of that some supply of energy only to burn it to create more CO2? And in the process, we have people hungry for food, and we have needs for the land. The energy should be, there should be an energy supply to solve the food problem and to solve the other problems, not the other way around. To me, that's illogical. To me, at least in my thinking, I'd rather go nuclear than go for the water supply. And you will see what's going to happen with the water supply. It's such a challenge for us as a planet. People do not realize how much we have ahead of us when we're dealing with water. Right now, there are 78 conflicts associated with water. 78 conflicts, United Nations statistics. We have conflicts relating to energy, and I know we had a lot of drama out of that. But wait enough time, you'll see what's going to happen with water. And what's going to happen is we're going to need energy to desalinate, and we're going to need energy to do a lot of the good work that we need to solve the problem technically. So that one, I would take exception to people that think you can have a local solution here and there, but that's not really a real solution. That's, to me, just gilding the lily in some ways. Okay. No progress, no benefit. Okay, no progress without research. What we have in front of us, a duality of technical problems and adaptive problems. My colleagues in political science and social science and all of that, they have to help us. Make sure awareness is informed and that people know the balance and know how to strategize and how to make informed decisions. And public policy should be informed with real factual premises or accurate factual premises that we could use in our discourse. But the technical side of it, honest to God, I really think that's where the saving grace is. Technology will save us again if we're wise enough to use it wisely. There is a lot of promise, and there is a lot of intelligence and innovation that would allow us to use our energy supply wisely in a clean fashion, starting with gas, starting with oil, starting with coal, starting with all of that. And again, technical problems associated with erecting and using or constructing nuclear reactors are not insurmountable, and we have better know-how now than we have about 25 years ago. If only we have the public support to actually invest further in that direction. So we need breakthroughs, and without breakthroughs, when you have breakthroughs, you have risk. And we don't have much time if we really wanted to have a sustainable quality life and a progress across the globe. And with that, I would say again, if we do that, of course, it's not a free lunch. There are costs involved. Thank you.
I am an environmental scientist by training, and with this group here at an educational institution, I'm going to be considerably more forthright than I am in other audiences, particularly around the state. Today, a report was released from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, consisting of over 300 committee members. The report took 3 years to make, and it is an alarming report. The report raises the threat of climate change to a whole new level, warning of sweeping consequences to life and livelihood. Previous reports by the IPCC suggested that most of the increase in greenhouse gases, and primarily carbon dioxide, are due to fossil fuel consumption worldwide. The report concluded that climate change is already having effects in real time, melting sea ice, thawing permafrost, killing coral reefs, and leading to heat waves, heavy rains, and mega disaster. And the worst is yet to come. Climate change poses a threat to global food stocks and to human security. The report actually suggests that global food supply is already decreasing as a result of climate change, and that death rates are very high as a result of climate change now. The summary mentioned the word risk more than 230 times. And at the forefront of the risks is the potential for humanitarian crisis. The report cataloged some of the disasters that have been visited around the planet since 2000, including killer heat waves in Europe, wildfires in Australia, and deadly floods in Pakistan. This is the most important change facing the planet today, and it is directly related to fossil fuels use for energy production around the world. This is our challenge. One of the trade-offs is, if you look worldwide, human quality of life is directly linked to commercial energy consumption. In fact, you can just about do a perfect regression between average per capita energy use and per capita GDP. Now, of course, we know that there's a lot more stratification countrywide than that, but the point is that quality of life is measured by energy consumption. So the challenges have to do with changing the way that we produce that energy and changing our energy efficiency. The United States is not the single largest producer of greenhouse gases. It is the second largest. China is the first. But we have among the highest production of greenhouse gases per person. That said, we have very high energy efficiency. We use about 9,000 BTUs per dollar in the United States. The best efficiency is in China. Is it dollars per BTU? The best efficiency, excuse me, is in Japan. Countries that have to import energy and pay a lot for it tend to work the hardest on their energy efficiency. So the opportunities really exist for us in changing the kind of technology we use and changing the efficiency with which we consume that energy. So in terms of other opportunities, the United States, as one of the largest consumers and largest consumers per person, has one of the greatest opportunities to lead, and that's where I'm going to leave it.
Okay, hi, I'm Chuck Mason. I'm a professor in the economics department. I'm going to give you a little anecdote before I launch into this. I found out chewing on lunch just in advance of today's show that Khalid and I share two things that I think are noteworthy. That's right. We're both alumni of the University of California, Berkeley. And in fact, we overlapped, I think, 3 years, which was, although I only took one engineering class in my whole life there. How many math classes did you take?
About 5 or 6.
Yeah. He wasn't in any of my math classes. Okay. Never, well, maybe he was. I'm going to pick up on a couple of themes that were touched on earlier. Khalid started off his conversation by talking about what physicists call entropy. For an economist, that's qualitatively the same thing as transactions costs and the frictions associated with doing business. And that'll be a main theme that I want to talk about. The second thing that I'd like to pick up on, the sort of the sprinkling of different kinds of energy markets that one might confront globally. You can think of markets for nuclear energy, or you can think of markets for wind energy, solar energy, natural gas. Each of these markets, importantly, is really local, or at least quasi-local, in the sense that you can't really export electrons from a nuclear power plant. You really can't export wind very far, nor solar. And natural gas is very expensive to export. There is some international trade in it, but it's tough. But every one of these markets interacts in the broader tableau with petroleum, which is an international market. And so in the grand scheme of things, even though these individually don't appear to be international in focus, there's always an international subtext to this. So let me start off kind of addressing the first point. I had agreed to participate in this roundtable in advance of something serendipitous sort of falling into my lap. I was asked to participate in a policy brief issued by Resources for the Future about a month ago in reference to the proposed lifting of the export ban on crude oil, and I will organize my conversation around that simply because it's on my mind right now and has been over the course of the last several weeks, largely because of important technological changes over the course of the last 10 to 15 years or so, principally thinking about things like hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, and extracting oil from the oil sands in Alberta. There has been a monumental increase in the magnitude of economically recoverable reserves. I think it's interesting, in fact, somewhat daunting, to think about this particular statistic, which I just stumbled onto over the weekend. We long thought that Saudi Arabia was the king of oil markets. If one seriously takes into account oil sands as a source of petroleum generally, or hydrocarbons, they're three, and they're a distant third: Canada, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, in that order. So this is a real sea change. The US, not very long ago, saw itself as an energy pauper. Hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling have changed that. So we're now in this completely new world where we have lots of resources. What we do not have, and this is really the challenge, I think, that needs to be addressed full frontally, we do not have the infrastructure to deliver those resources to market. That's the transactions cost. We have insufficient pipeline capacity heading out of the Bakken field. We have insufficient pipeline capacity coming from Canada. We have insufficient pipeline capacity coming from West Texas. And we have something of a mismatch, if you will. Not all crude oil is created equal. Some is quite light, some is quite heavy, and historically the way that US refineries have been set up, largely because of the path that was taken over the 1990s, early part of this century, refineries are geared to process heavy crude. The tight oil deposits in the Bakken and Eagle Ford and West Texas tend to be very light. They don't match up well with our refineries. There's lots of heavier crude oil that would match up well with the refineries, but it's overseas, or it's in Canada, where we have delivery constraints. If one imagined a new world where there weren't fetters, there weren't inhibitions to international trade in crude oil, particularly an export ban — the US has banned exporting of crude oil since the OPEC days in the 1970s, you would imagine that light crude from the US would be sent someplace else, like maybe Europe, where it is valuable and could be processed effectively, and we would import relatively less valuable crude oils from Venezuela, for example, targeting those to the refineries because that's the way that they are currently designed. In the grand scheme of things, though this would, in the short term, likely raise oil prices, in the long term it's an inducement to expand exploration and development of fields within the US and in Canada, and all that is likely to lead to, with that increase in supply, is likely to lead to lower prices over time, maybe in 5 years. The greater alignment of crude types to refinery capacity is going to mean more efficient refining, which is going to mean expanded supply of gasoline. So in the short term, we might have higher gasoline prices. Looking forward towards the end of this decade, I suspect lower. This is somewhat counterintuitive, I think. Thinking about natural gas, and this is something that I hope this comes up in the conversation afterwards. Nobody's talked about it yet, but it's hard not to think about the exporting natural gas, particularly given current events in Ukraine and Crimea. We haven't the capacity to export natural gas. Why? We haven't really needed to, not for decades. We've imported to the extent that liquefied natural gas was traded internationally, it was imported. So there were terminals set up in the US to receive imported LNG, which then had to be regasified. If you want to export it, it has to be compressed. So it takes some time to do that. There are terminals that are in place, probably will be exporting within the next year and a half, maybe a little bit sooner, and that will make for a more internationally integrated natural gas market. How am I doing?
Couple minutes.
Okay. I'm pretty close to being done here. Oh, I do want to say one other thing, I think. An interesting phenomenon that results because of the delivery constraints on oil and gas resources is that if you think of this flowing down a river, that's a nice allegory, I think. So upstream means the source, the deposits, the wellheads, the collecting areas, and so on. Upstream prices for oil and gas tend to be depressed in large measure because of restrictions on export capabilities or pipeline transmission. A simple little story about this has to do with this state. Gas, by and large, flows from the west to the east. Comes out of the Jonah Field, goes to the Opal trading hub, goes into a pipeline, goes to Cheyenne, then it goes out to the Midwest. Prices are collected at the Opal hub and the Cheyenne hub. Those prices track each other very well in times when there's ample pipeline capacity, and they fly apart in times when there are not. Particularly, the Opal price tends to be relatively depressed, the Cheyenne price a bit higher. Right? So importantly then, for folks who are extracting natural gas, they're getting these signals that say don't extract so much because the prices are lower. The price for Albertan crude is on the order of $20 less than the price at the trading hub in Cushing, Oklahoma, the so-called West Texas Intermediate Trading Hub. Right? And you can imagine what that means as regards incentives to extract. Now, Indy was talking about climate change. You can't ignore the tar sands gorilla in the elevator here. You might not want prices in Alberta to go up 20 bucks, right? But if your bag really is, I don't want carbon, then I think there's probably a better, a more direct way to do that. It's called a carbon tax. And with that conflagrationary comment, I'll quit.
It's always good to go last. So yes, I'm Sarah Strauss, and well, I think probably you expect to hear economists and engineers and environmental scientists, all the E's, talking about energy. Anthropology is perhaps not one of the disciplines that you associate with this, so I'm going to do a plug here, but also point out, so I've got a new book out called Cultures of Energy. It's got a really fun cover, so that's why I bring it for show and tell, also because anthropologists like show and tell. But the point being here that there are a whole bunch of anthropologists actually working on the energy topic, and it's something that is central because although the word culture was not mentioned by anybody else, and there are many things going down the line here that I completely agree with my colleagues on, but I do have a word to put on many of the issues and contexts that they've brought up, and that is, in fact, culture. So anthropology deals with not just arrowheads. I know in Wyoming, you know, it's synonymous with archaeology, and that's where people go with this. Ancient technologies, also important and good. Uses of water, uses of land, uses of resources, but also deals with how people in the contemporary world think about, give meaning to, share practices about, develop technologies, et cetera. And all of these things are completely relevant to, obviously, how we think about what we're going to do with our current and future energy resources and technologies. That said, I want to just leap again to the place where I was going to start. Indy started there for me, which is Oh, this is so good. The cover of USA Today, front page. UN escalates climate concerns. It actually beat the Final Four. Okay, just barely, and it's in black, not red, and actually baseball trumps all. So we have a little view into the window of American culture as to what we're concerned about. But the fact that it did make top story in USA Today is not an insignificant thing to think about. And so anthropologists, in fact, do tend to take what might seem to other disciplines that have a particular angle on research problems, might take a range of things that seem irrelevant into consideration. And we call this actually a holistic perspective. And I want to assert today that that particular perspective, when combined with some of the other approaches that I will talk about, is central to dealing with these wicked problems, as they are called, of climate change, energy, and water. Those are definitely the top three in my list as well. And adding in health is that into that mix. I also have a background in public health, and so I always keep an eye to that. All three of these issues bring us squarely into confrontation with big, sticky problems that make us want to run away and stick our heads in the sand, which unfortunately is kind of how we've been approaching the problem in this country. Not so much in other countries. So that I want to also get to. Anthropology, again, takes as its object everything that people do wherever they are and through time. So we start with hominids, we go all the way through. And we can make connections across these. But in this particular case, I want to point out, and this actually is one of the conclusions in the AR5, Working Group 2, of which I had a small part as a reviewer, so I've been eagerly awaiting the final result, which came out today. It's very clear that if instead of thinking, oh my God, energy, oh my God, water, oh my God, climate change, all of these different things in separate frames, if we start to realize that because they are implicated together, the solutions that we address need also to be engaged holistically, and we can't really afford to blinder ourselves and take one at a time. It's clear, and some other countries have started to work on this, that by refusing to silo these problems, we get not only more cost-efficient solutions, but also better buy-in. It's a lot easier if you think about taking a single step that addresses three big problems than three steps in different directions. So I think this is logical, but it also speaks to the fact that we can reframe these problems sometimes and come up with some different approaches than a strictly technological or economic or environmental approach might give us. So that's one of the big things. I wanted to agree with absolutely every one of Dr. Gassim's conclusions. We are certainly addressing a lot of different things from different angles, but really with the same conclusions. I do want to point out, and this is actually for a point of conversation because I'm not quite sure where he was going with the issues of local solutions being window dressing. What I really would like to stress, and what I think we're seeing in other parts of the world, is that issues of siting and scale are critical to understanding which mix we're going to have in which place at which time. And so I would absolutely agree that we need the answer. When people ask me what is the answer to climate change or to energy resources, my answer is yes, okay? A, nobody is going to leave the coal or the oil in the ground, so clearly we do need those technologies improved to the point of minimal impact, because whether we are taking it out or somebody is starting a war to take it out from somewhere else, it's unlikely to be left in the ground because the energy demand is so great, because we have 1.4 billion people with no electricity whatsoever, 3 billion people using only solid fuels, traditional solid fuels, so dung or wood. We already have a deforestation problem. So there are a lot of issues in terms of which mix, but I think that by attending to the realities of distributed energy systems and a very distributed mix, and also, as Dr. Mason pointed out, that we need, or actually both of you perhaps pointed out, we certainly need to be thinking ahead. And obviously, yes, a nuclear plant has a certain amount of lead time. All of these technologies do, and when we do not create policies that are friendly towards the range, and instead seek to restrict to what our current mix is, for example, and one could make that argument about this state at the moment, and many other places in the US, that we have been privileging one kind of energy resource over others. We need to create a regulatory environment that is going to be stable enough and friendly enough to develop all of these different kinds of resources with an eye to the future, which includes, again, attention to the water resource issue, attention to the climate change impacts, and attendance to the health issues. All of these are things that we are seeing as dominant problems at this moment, and they are things that have to, none of them can be left out of the mix as we develop policy. How am I doing? Okay, so I'm pretty much there. One thing I do want to also point out is that we have, and I think Indy got to this a little bit, we're efficient, but we're not that efficient, or not as efficient as we could be, okay? And partly it's because, and this comes back to a question of what some might call education, but I prefer to think about it in a less one-way street. Education tends to be what we give to them so they understand what we need to do. And anthropology tends to take a little more inclusive dialogic perspective on this. But the fact is that very few people understand their energy bills. They pay them, they grumble when they get too high. There are a lot of resources that now are being developed, apps for everything, that can help us be much more efficient and get the low-hanging fruit. Also policy decisions that can be made, that have been made in other places, that can help us with that. And I think when we, to end this, I spent my last year sabbatical in India. India actually has the only renewable energy ministry in the world. Maybe somebody else has started recently, but to my knowledge, it is the only one existing in the world. They have what you would call a space program, level push, for renewables on all fronts. Obviously, one can argue with their population that they need to do this, and with so many people who are in energy poverty. But it is an example for us about what innovation and broad spectrum support for every possible technology exploration, from the most basic science to applications from the household to the state and nation level, is going on. And so there are many different exciting ways to approach this. I'll stop there.
Since we ended up on policy, I want to make a few comments. It seems to me that it's about choice, it's about planning, it's about risk, and it's about trade-offs. And I think that's where the disagreement is, in many cases, in terms of what your tolerance for trade-offs is. And across this group, there's an awful lot of agreement. I would say that the regulatory environment, the national debate and context for planning for an energy future, rationally, is about zero. Has been since Jimmy Carter failed to have an energy policy. And so as a result, I see things that happen in states, in the US context, driving a lot of policy. And we have debates that are very, very opposite of one another. One is war on coal, and then the other side of the debate. And I think we need to get the pragmatic middle engaged on these discussions, because there's no silver bullet. The answer to the energy challenge is different today than it will be in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And so that's kind of been my interest. One of the things that's interesting about the unconventional energy boom that's going on is, again, I mean, you have to take into context what Indy's mentioning and what others are mentioning in terms of the true costs of energy use. And yet, the premise of the panel opening up was, and yet we still use energy. And whether it's your viewscape that gets impacted because of windmills, I think we're industrializing the rural West. We're doing a lot of things, and these are just a lot of choices that we have to live with. And I'm becoming very interested in that maybe in some cases it doesn't matter what happens nationally or internationally. It's whether you can put that pipeline in, or it's whether you can put that, put the trains to the coal port. So the local aspects of this discussion are something that we can open up to the broader discussion as well. And I just kind of put a plug on the political science part of it. I am very nervous when we get into the zone of the politics of vulnerability and scarcity. When you get into that kind of discussion and you don't take advantage in a very near-term view of really addressing these issues aggressively, then it gets a lot harder. And you see that very much on the context of the discussions on the supply side of energy versus the demand side of energy. When you talk about energy efficiency, you go to China and you interview people, they'll talk to you all the day. There's a lot of cooperation. Lawrence Livermore, the Japanese and the Chinese are doing a lot of cooperation on energy efficiency. So it's not all about East China Sea. But what do you get? You hear about the East China Sea. So I'm interested in addressing the low-hanging fruit and having the broader discussion of all these issues. I'd like to invite the panelists, if they want to comment briefly on anything, then I'm going to open it up. But does anybody want to add a couple of things that maybe didn't come out that will spur the discussion?
Okay. Yeah, I had intended to say something about the trade-off between pipelines and rail, and it just slipped my mind. And that is, you're going to get development you're going to get larger development in those energy provinces that are prolific. And they tend not to be close to population centers. So somehow, one way or another, the oil or whatever has to flow. And it's now flowing a lot by rail, which I think should scare you. I think the rail companies would like not to have you be scared, but I think that should scare you. Largely because the fleet of rail cars are woefully out of date, and because the petroleum that they are shipping is quite incendiary. It happens to have a lot of suspended natural gas components in it. So it tends to blow up more, and hence the debacle in Quebec last summer and similar sorts of things. Those, I think, are just tips of the iceberg. They, to me, are much scarier events than the infrequent nuclear meltdown that may or may not have killed. Chernobyl killed some people. I don't know that Fukushima will. No evidence would suggest that the meltdown or the partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island did something like that. 50 people died in Quebec. Right? So those are pretty hard and fast numbers.
I mentioned the choices made in Germany as an example of a local decision to address a public concern. It came after Fukushima, and it came, I think it's sort of an overreaction for the moment, because the Germans know well that the energy density from wind is limited. It's going to do some good, but it's not going to replace the amount of energy expenditures they have. They're fairly efficient. They're good in conservation. Actually, we'll give them high marks for conservation in Germany. And that's one of the mixes in the energy portfolio, is reducing the use of energy and conserving and wisely using whatever you have. So we'll give them a marker there. You're doing well in conservation. You're doing well with wind where it's appropriate. Again, I'm of the opinion it should not be in the perimeter of the city. That's ugly as hell, but that's my opinion. So, does it mean they don't have an alternative? They do. The nuclear alternative is viable, high density, secure, and sustainable. Okay, they say, well, we're getting the gas from Russia. Guess what? Maybe it's not as secure as you think. And then telling them that you're not going to have nuclear, what did you do? You just opened the door for the risk, a greater risk assessment that's adverse to your side. But again, I absolutely agree. It's a lot of local decisions are made, but they have to be done in balance and in view of what's in front of it. Every technology requires investment. You take the wind, the gas, and all that, they require grids, that requires a lot of work. So nothing is for free. But when we strategize, we have to be aware of what works and what's needed. There are solutions which I consider the 10-20% solution, and they are what I call the big elephant, the 80% solution. That's a nuclear and fossil. For fossil and nuclear, we need to know how to use them wisely and safely. It's not arguable. It's just a question of applying ourselves to that. On the other side, the 10-20% solution, knock yourself out. Put whatever windmills you want. and go ahead and use the 10 times as much land as the size of the city to produce the energy it needs. Tell me if that would work. Anyway.
Yeah, I just have a couple of observations. I fly all over the world to talk about climate change. I probably have, I am in the top 1/1000% in the world in terms of my carbon footprint. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in our individual and collective behavior. One of the places I serve on EPA Science Advisory Board, where we go and we talk about how important it is for the United States to control CO2 emissions. There are the technology exists to not have to fly to these places. I mean, we can do video conferencing, for instance. So there are a lot of decisions we can make right now that we have the technology to do that actually probably have the biggest bang for the buck in the near-term future. By the way, we have a really active and terrific campus sustainability committee, and if you have interest in making a local impact, that's a great place to do it.
Yeah, I have to jump in on the aesthetics here because, and again, come back to this cover, which is difficult to see, but actually the cover of the book is a result of an architectural competition from an energy company in Iceland that wanted to take their power access, so the power lines that we are used to seeing, and again, I want to point out used to seeing, turbines are new, okay? And they wanted to make them fit into the landscape in a different way. And so what these are giant people. They're modular. It's a very cool architectural concept. This is, again, Photoshop. But,
are you trying to sell a book?
No, I'm not. I'm trying to make a point about aesthetics. And so you can make boys and girls, and they move across the landscape, and they stand, they can do all kinds of things, and it again makes us think about our implications as human, the implications of us as humans using this energy and engaged and a part of it in our action. And so the point about what kinds of tolerances we have for which kinds of viewscapes and view sheds is a really important one. We ripped up this country end to end, building highways in the 60s. Many of you don't even remember that and weren't born then, okay? This changed the landscape dramatically for a cost that people felt was worthwhile. We put power lines everywhere. They're not pretty. Most of them are nowhere near as cool as this, okay? Turbines symbolize a lot of things to a lot of people. In talking to folks in the state of Wyoming, it means a very different thing to be pulling water with a traditional style turbine for use on your own ranch, perhaps, than for sending energy to California or Arizona. So the meanings that are imbued in these technologies help determine the aesthetic values that we put on them. And I think we have to recall that that's not just window dressing. It has very much to do with the choices we make, the policies we put into place, and ultimately the technologies we select.
Okay, having said that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Garrett.
My question is about the tipping point. What do you guys think the tipping point will be to change public opinion? And if that tipping point is natural disasters, do you think that our environment will already be past the point where we can influence the change in the environment, or do we have to look more at adaptation?
That sounds like an indie question.
Yeah, I'm afraid that we are probably past one of the most important tipping points, and that adaptation certainly needs to be a primary focus right now. That is not to say that if we continue burning fossil fuels at the same rate that we are, that it won't make a difference for future generations. But the tipping, well, we're at the environmental tipping point now. We could change our behavior immediately, and we're still going to have increases in climate change because of some biophysical feedbacks. But in terms of, I'm not a good person to predict behavior. I do feel as though there are economic tools at hand to change behavior.
Chuck, do you want to comment?
Sure. It's called a carbon tax. Yeah, let me, right, okay, so the answer, I think, to your question, let me give you a little historical backdrop. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act emerged because of broad perceptions in the U.S. that there were environmental catastrophes at hand. You know, and there were some iconic things like the Cuyahoga River burning on its way to Lake Erie. And those things pushed a I want to say bilateral. Is that a fair say? Anyway, there was a consensus within the Congress to support. Right. Right, and it may be that that's the sort of thing that has to happen now, and it may be that broad-scale hurricanes and tornadoes will do that. I don't know. But yeah, the economic tools are well understood, I think, and have been broadly espoused by many of my colleagues for a long time. In some ways, they've taken root. You drew reference to sort of the inefficiency in the U.S. The EU would seem to be a poster child there. They have a functioning cap-and-trade system for carbon permits, but it was politically mangled and is horribly organized and have way oversubscribed the number of permits, and so the carbon price is so small the Germans are happy to shut down nukes and import coal-generated power. Right, and you know, so yes, but there's a yes, but know the tools. We just have to use them properly.
Right, and yeah, for tipping points and for what to do, I think that we have a number of different. Again, tools, I absolutely agree that the carbon tax, for many of these cases, again, we have the theory, we don't have the practice down very well. It's, again, as Indy said, very clear that we have already, we've been talking about this for a long time. This is AR5. The very first, actually, this fun little fact, the very first climate change conference in the US was held, and this is very much tied to energy. It was held in 1975, and it was convened by Margaret Mead, the one anthropologist you might have actually heard of, with Steve Schneider, who was one of, sadly left us too early, but was one of the most significant climate scientists as well. And they convened this in 1975, right in the throes of the energy crisis. We've known for a long time what's needed, and certainly the incentives at various levels have not been high, and at the same time, again, one of the things that I really want to stress in terms of thinking about this as a cultural issue is that culture are us, okay? And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. It matters what we do as individuals, what we do in communities, what we do at regional, national, and international levels. It matters that we talk to each other and that we communicate our values. Okay, and so when somebody says, oh, it doesn't really make any difference if I change a light bulb, at some level, perhaps that's right, but actually in terms of how people work, making a behavioral change, however small, that gets you thinking about the consequences and the relationships between your actions and the environment, the resources, the consequences, is a really big thing, actually. And so that's one of the, in terms of what do we do, and is there a tipping point, and is it a crisis that is needed? Part of the problem there is also, you know, for us in the US, is that we're in these nice temperate zones. Yes, we've had some storms. Yeah, okay, we've had some cold weather. Yes, the polar vortex is in fact related to global climate change because, in fact, when you look at what the temperature was in Washington, D.C., and somebody was shivering, yeah, well, Fairbanks, it was like 44 above at the same time. Not so good for Arctic ice and for the feedbacks that Indy was talking about. It is also the case in terms of how people perceive these things, that when you survey people about whether they think climate change is happening, if you put them in a warm room, they have a different response than if you put them in a cold room. Okay, it's not about me, folks. It's not about you. It actually was pretty darn hot in Australia with forest fires raging when it was snowing on Washington this year. And so this sort of political decision making by what my temperature at the moment is a bit of a problem, but it's a real issue in terms of the effect. So I think that we need, again, back to the scale issue. We need to be addressing this from all these levels, and some of the problems are obviously much more difficult to tackle at the global scale, but many things can and will change if they start with individuals.
Okay, I'd like to take a couple of questions. I was going to call on John Rader and Eric simultaneously.
Hello, thank you. Given these dire risks outlined by the IPCC and the lack of a global panacea for energy production, what's the potential for small-scale local energy production like microhydro or geothermal, passive solar, those things.
And then Eric, do you have a quick question to tack onto that?
Yeah, we've been talking about supply, demand, technology, so forth. What about the impact of speculation on pricing and delivery and so on? That hasn't been mentioned at all, so I was just curious.
I'll take the last one first. With the fact that we have right now a good supply of natural gas, and we have kind of the psychological comfort zone for a lot of people around the globe that the energy crisis is not upon us because we have a means of mitigating some of the circumstances. The outbidding, I think, is going to see a decline. You're not going to see people outbidding each other in the marketplace and having an inflated cost for the energy supply, particularly oil. I think it's waning off. It used to be in the market you have about 500,000 to 1 million marginal presence for the oil supply that people need. And airlines want that oil. Others want that oil. So they outbid it because there's very little amount present, and their fear of uncertainty drives the market in a higher and higher, basically, cost to the energy supply. So I think that's we're in better shape right now than we used to be. The first question has to do with what?
Local energy production?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked that question because, again, I'm thinking we have to really look at the big picture. The energy supply, like I said, there is the 80% solution and there is the rest. We could start with conservation, and estimates are by 2030 or so, we could reach a 10% level in conservation if in the developing country, if we apply ourselves and take what the Europeans have started doing a long time ago and successfully implemented. So, okay, so 10% you give it to conservation. That's a minimum, kind of a reasonable estimate. Then you're left with the renewables. Depends on who you're talking to, but it could be anywhere from 20 to 30%, they say. I'd say more to 20% or so. That leaves you with what? Leaves you with 70% for fossil and nuclear to cover. Right now, people estimate the nuclear will cover about 10%. In my assessment, that's really foolish. It should go a little bit higher. It should be a little bit more aggressive than that. Having said that, the fossil use has to be taken with the understanding that we have to have advances in technology to make sure we're mitigating some of the risks in the environmental side. It's not going to be a free ride. If you look at this, descriptions that I gave you percentages-wise, and if we're willing to invest another 24%, 25% in the energy cost, we could sustain the CO2 emissions to roughly about 400 ppm. That's sort of sustainable and sort of livable, and we could manage, and hopefully with enough technology we can do even better. But it's not going to be free of cost and free of engagement from the public and the policymakers in making sure the strategies have some sense to them. You cannot promise people that the renewables are going to solve their problem, knowing that it's not going to solve their problem. It's going to solve only part of their problem. And renewables will be only feasible in certain areas if you have the infrastructure to support them. So to me, again, I'm not sounding an alarm or anything. I'm just telling you the reality of it is for the next 2 generations, fossil and nuclear are the best bet for high-density energy. Let's manage them correctly. Let's invest in the technologies that would make their use viable and safe, and try to sustain the environmental aspect of it at levels of CO2 that we could live with. We have technologies that could help us with that. The question is public will and abilities to engage the rest of the world, and I know the rest of the world are balking at times, and they're not coming to the table with as much enthusiasm as you'd like. So it is, again, an adaptive technical problem combination, and it goes to the heart of the matter, to policy and strategy work that needs to be brought to bear to solve the problems we're facing.
I want to put a point on that question. There are those who have great faith in technology,
Right.
as this form to solve our problems, and there are
Right.
those who don't.
Right.
And I would actually just like, if anybody else would like to address that particular point on technology, and what are we really talking about here in terms of technology, and does it solve, to what degree does it address the concerns you have, Indy? Just to put a point on it.
Garrett Hardin wrote a pretty controversial article quite a while ago called The Tragedy of the Commons, and if you remember, the theme in that was no technological solution. And it's not that there's no technological solution. I comfort my engineer next to me, but this issue of public will is has considerably more impact at the moment.
Well, specifically, actually, to Garrett Hardin and the tragedy of the commons, the fact is that your question about scale is exactly on target for this, because although Hardin, as a biologist, concerned with population issues and the degradation of resources, said that there was no way except top-down regulation to manage for the tragedy of the commons. In fact, anthropologist and Ellie Ostrom, an economist who recently died, one of the few who worked extensively with anthropologists looking at smaller scale solutions to resource management issues, and it's very clear that there are circumstances within a certain scale range in which we do a pretty darn good job of managing resources, common pool resources. And I would say that the issue here in terms of scale is that we do know that, for example, renewable energy at the very local scale helps stabilize the grid. And there are things that we can do that, again, are hand in hand. It's not saying it's one solution, only big. If we only have the discourse about capital W wind, about capital C coal, we have problems because there aren't one-size-fits-all solutions. And to give you just the very far end of that, in India, again, I was privileged to witness many different creative solutions. One of the best coming from the University of Mysore that I've ever seen is they have a Center for Renewable Energy and Sustainable Technologies there that is just phenomenal, has done all kinds of cool things, but the best is the modern bullock cart. And so a bullock cart, that wooden wheels, an old wooden cart with a bullock in front going to and from the farmer's fields, and he took the director of the center designed a wonderful generator based on old abandoned car and bicycle parts that goes under the bullock cart. It plugs into a car battery. At the end of the day, after everyday normal use, the farmer has not changed his behavior one whit, but he can now power his cell phone, give light to his kids for homework, and do a lot of things that improve quality of life. So again, I caution the quality of life being connected to GDP. There are plenty of people working right now on alternatives to GDP to take into account traditional lifestyles and ways of living more lightly on the land that don't have to be measured in those national terms. So again, I think that the question of scale is a critical one.
I'm going to take a crack at answering the speculation question and yours. To my taste, speculation is all about people making bets on what might happen in the future. Most of the people who were involved in the fracking revolution succeeded or failed by touching that particular taste. They found people who were willing to bet on an emerging hypothetical technology. And it really was just because of that particular thread that we were able to gain the sort of traction and have the sorts of technological improvements that arose. Imagine that there was somebody just on the other side of campus who was just that close to cracking the carbon capture puzzle. And all he needed was a handful of people to write $1 million check. You would want them to be able to do that, right? And so I would be very, very cautious about things like putting clamps on speculators, because it's a short ride from there to putting clamps on things like betting on speculative innovations.
So quick question, this will be the last one.
Indy, thanks for putting the emphasis on climate change in the IPCC report and the terrible urgency of that issue. There was another report that came out a couple months ago on per capita CO2 emissions, which placed our state at the top, 112 tons per person per capita per year, 6 times the national average. And I know in your presentation you emphasized per capita consumption and the need to bring that down as part of the solution. My question is, what are the opportunities we have here in Wyoming as the largest energy producing state with the largest per capita CO2 emissions? What are the opportunities we have to address this terribly urgent global problem? Thanks.
One thing I should just add about your comment about that report, the denominator has a lot to do with a quotient in that one, meaning that we've got a pretty small population, and when that happens, you end up with a pretty large quotient. I think that we don't have many economic incentives for conservation in this state, and that is probably the most impactful way to get there. I really think that the university can lead in terms of taking action with sustainability. Your town of Jackson is certainly leading the state in terms of what's happening citywide, and what your town is doing is saving people money because of conservation and sustainability initiatives. So I think we ought to celebrate some of our successes at UW and in Jackson, and have the people of Wyoming understand that it's in their best interest to invest in conservation.
A couple of announcements, that is, that we resume over to my left in the far ballroom, focusing on the many faces of human insecurity, lessons from the field. This is a faculty research panel. I'd invite you to please have some more food since it's sitting over here, and it'd be nice not to be wasteful. And I'd also just say, as a final thought, let's thank our panelists.